Y en esta ocasión, junto con un invitado muy especial, vamos a pasar a hacer una pequeña revisión del mundo. Iam Bremer es presidente y fundador, por cierto, del Eurasia Group, una organización de iniciativa privada de análisis del manejo de riesgos en el mundo. Como tal, tiene que manejar, tiene que administrar y tiene que supervisar información proveniente de todo el mundo, evaluarla para hacer sus recomendaciones y hacer su trabajo respecto a sus clientes. Iam, thank you, gracias very much for being here. Ian, there are too short times, too many questions, but let me throw to you one of your first phrases. This is the return of geopolitics. But geopolitics for us, it was something that was being played in Europe at one point. Now, what is the meaning of geopolitics right now?
Well, we've had 25 years after the Cold War where the presumption was the United States could more or less be on autopilot, with the exception of 9/11. And the response to that was very obvious. But nonetheless, there was a belief that the major pieces of the world, the big powers in the world, more or less fit together. And globalization was bringing them even closer. And there wasn't a possibility of great power war going forward and all the rest. It's very obvious when we look at the world in 2015 that the challenges that people experience, that the uncertainties that we have, are very much about geopolitics. We've lost Russia. And it wasn't like who lost Russia in the Clinton age. We've lost Russia. That relationship is broken. It's gone. They're orienting towards China. They're fighting a direct military war in Ukraine. NATO suddenly is relevant again. The Middle East is completely imploding. Failed states everywhere around the region. The growth of the most significant and terrorist organization that we've seen in the history of the world today. And in the context of all of that, a Europe that no one feels like is holding together, the transatlantic relationship that was the core of the post-war order seeming much more fragile. So geopolitics very clearly back and getting only larger as we look forward.
But geopolitics, the way that you describe it, it's basically something of the Northern Hemisphere. Basically a game among Russia, the European Union, or whatever is left of them, China, maybe Japan, but countries like Mexico, Brazil, how do they fit there? Or are just in the choir?
Fortunately, when we talk about the Western Hemisphere, we're talking about an area that is pretty insulated from geopolitics, and one of the reasons that the U.S. economy has done comparatively well in the last year is because everyone seeing uncertainty thinks that U.S. treasuries are a good place to be, U.S. real estate is a good place to be, the dollar is a good place to be, and Mexico, which 80% of Mexico's trade is the United States. They're very tied into that. And I'm not trying to suggest that the geopolitics of the world don't matter. I mean, certainly China now is the largest nation of trade of a larger number of countries than any other country in the world, including the United States. And Brazil, China's more important to their economic outcomes today than the United States is. That's true of Chile. It's certainly true of Venezuela. And so even there, we start to see the rise of what will soon be the world's largest economy. But this will be a country that does not share any of the core values that the United States or the Europeans built the post-war order on. It is an authoritarian state. It is state capitalist, so the state is the principal actor in the Chinese economy. And of course, it will still be poor. And so that is something that the Mexicans are not feeling yet, honestly, but you will. You will. And certainly when we think about Latin America in 10 years' time, the role of China, particularly, and the role of some other emerging markets as well, will start to be very significant.
Nevertheless, and let me ask you about this, there was about 2 or 3 months ago, the Council on Foreign Relations of New York came out with a report talking about the need and maybe what would be the possibilities and advantages of what I call the North American region, whatever that means. But they claim that the integration of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico may become, and could become the major economic force.
Well, energy is a big piece of that, of course. Immigration regimes that are not perfect but nonetheless function definitely helps. promising demographics in this region, geopolitical stability, NAFTA, but also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is one of the few pieces of legislation that's actually going to happen out of the United States in 2015. All of that definitely implies that Mexico, the United States, and Canada are going to get more integrated, not less going forward. And I think that's a big advantage. Look, in a world where geopolitics are much more destabilizing, living in this area is very helpful. I mean, the United States has amazing neighbors. Who wouldn't want to have Mexico and Canada as neighbors? Turkey would love to have Mexico and Canada as their neighbors. It's not happening. And that's a very significant problem. China would love to have countries that align, but of course China has to deal with North Korea. They have to deal with Japan. I mean, they're in an environment that's much more unstable. Almost anywhere you look in the world where the economics are solid, the geopolitics are more problematic, except right here in North America, and that is clearly a very big advantage for anyone living here.
Now, you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia. If for some people in Latin America in general, maybe in Africa, Russia, China, I mean, they have this ring of former Soviet Union, the Red China, etc., and they're seen like an alternative for the U.S., like, you know, against the U.S. power. But this alternative is not an ideological alternative anymore.
No, it's an economic alternative. It's a power alternative. It's much more realpolitik, right? It's the kind of thing that Kissinger would recognize, as opposed to you know, communism versus democracy. Look, part of the reason for that is because a lot of the United States ideology, pro-free market, took a hit with 2008. Pro-democracy took a hit with the 2000 elections, took a hit with Guantanamo, took a hit with rendition, Iraq, Afghanistan, took a hit with the Arab Spring, where democracies are not necessarily moving in the directions that we want to see. So the United States doesn't have the same ideological force that it did globally before. The Soviet Union, of course, doesn't exist. And China doesn't draw countries to it because of ideology. China's ideology is statist. It's all about China. China draws countries to it by sheer economic force. They're now the second largest economy in the world. Within 10 years, they'll be the largest. And their influence over countries in the region is becoming as great as America's influence over Mexico, but with a very different kind of system. I think that's going to become extremely interesting.
It's an interesting game, though. But now, going back to Eurasia, you know, Europe seems to be like the great experiment, the great counterbalance even for the United States in terms of economy at one point. Like, you know, the great lesson on democracy and how to overcome the obstacles of history and the ancient enmities and regionalism and nationalisms, and all of a sudden all of these are coming up again.
Yeah.
What is the future of Europe? Does it have any, the United Europe as a chance?
What's so unfortunate is that we've known for many decades that there was a fundamental mismatch in Europe, that you could not have a currency union without a fiscal union, that it was, as a consequence, creating lending practices that were unsustainable. We knew the Greeks weren't paying taxes, but the banks still lent. We knew that you needed austerity in these countries, but the banks still lent because they were short-term focused. Then we had a crisis, and that crisis was severe. Mr. Piketty, the famous French economist, writing about the hollowing out of the middle classes. This is a problem in the U.S., of course, but it's a disaster in Europe. And when you have countries where the entire youth, everyone under 30, thinks that there were just no opportunities for me unless I leave the country, where you have populations with 50% youth unemployment, where you have countries where there is no prospect to create serious productivity going forward, and the German response to that is more austerity. What the response is, we're getting a whole bunch of parties that politically are no longer oriented towards supporting Europe. That's what we see in Greece with the new election and the government there, Syriza. It's what we're seeing with the rise of Podemos in Spain. It's what we're seeing in Portugal. It's what we're seeing in France with the Front National, Ireland. I mean, across Europe, you have parties that are becoming much more popular that simply say, we don't accept what you've been doing with these countries for the past decades. And it's also in a part of the world, not like Mexico, not like the US, where the geopolitics are dangerous. You have record numbers of refugees coming from Muslim countries that are not accepted into Europe, but they're there, and it's creating violence. And then you have a war with Russia and Ukraine that is destabilizing Europe and is economically causing a great deal of hardship because the Europeans have that connection, and that's not getting fixed. So they can't fix their domestic environment. Their external environment is getting worse, but they don't have an ability to respond to it. Europe, which was it is the largest common market in the world, and it has been the core partner of the United States to try to ensure a level of stability in the global order. Europe now looks in very, very difficult shape.
And let me ask you about Russia. I mean, Russia seems to be playing a very complex game, but it's a game that has been playing for the last 200-300 years. It's geopolitics again, ensuring its borders, right?
Yes.
It is that what it's all about in Ukraine, for instance?
If you ask any Russian, what is the most important foreign policy interest we have in the whole world, it's Ukraine. It's critical. It's critical in terms of history. It's critical in terms of any influence in their own region, their own sphere of influence, as they call it, for their plans of a Eurasian economic union. It's critical for their military defense complex, their supply chains, also their bases, and a significant piece of Russian population and Russian-speaking population. The Russians have felt like they've been in decline now for a couple of decades. And they feel like the Americans have facilitated that with NATO enlargement, with missile defense in Eastern Europe, with energy diversification going into their backyard in Central Asia, taking the energy and building pipelines so it can go to Europe and not to Russia. And Ukraine was the last straw. And that was when Putin stood up in front of his parliament and said, we're not going to take this anymore. Even if it's going to hurt us economically, we're going to stand up to the Americans. And I would say that a majority of Russians have been waiting for someone to say that for 20 years now. That's very dangerous, and clearly it's not going to help Russia's position in the world economically. But the Russians are proud of this, and so we have a very big fight, and we have a reaction from the Americans and the Europeans that is rhetorically very strong, but the reality is there's not much fight there.
Okay, let's wait for that. A ustedes los esperamos en un par de minutos, continuaremos esta conversación. Eres scary. Gracias por seguir con nosotros en esta edición del Foro de Análisis Global de EXCELSIOR. Nuestro invitado, Iam Bremer, presidente y fundador del grupo Eurasia Group, una organización de análisis global, de análisis de riesgos. And maybe one of the questions that I'm itching to make, actually, it is 20 years ago the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, used to claim that the United States was the indispensable nation. I mean, the Iron Curtain was just falling apart. There was no discussion about the strength or the power of the supremacy of the United States in the world. 20 years later, though, it seems that there was not such a thing as an indispensable nation, and that supremacy is questioned.
That's right. It was the appropriate term at the time. And it was the appropriate term after World War II, because, of course, the United States created the world order in its image, rebuilt the Europeans with the Marshall Plan, rebuilt Japan with General MacArthur. The United States created the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank and the Bretton Woods Accord on currency, and all of those institutions sounded global, but they were American, just like the World Series is an American institution. Sounds global, you got a Canadian team, but it's an American institution. And the U.S. was, of course, the indispensable nation to create that world order, and acted as the world policeman, and the world's fireman, and the world's investigator. That's gone. It's gone. The United States is still the world's only superpower, but the U.S. no longer knows what it wants to do with that influence, knows it doesn't want to be the world's policeman anymore, is completely unclear how assertive it wishes to be in the Middle East, knows it doesn't want boots on the ground to fix Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Libya and Nigeria and Mali and all of these countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, we can keep going, the list is getting longer every day. And that's not to say that the U.S. is withdrawing. The United States is not becoming isolationist, but the interest of America in fixing other people's problems has gone down, and the importance of allies for the United States has diminished somewhat, and China's become much more important, and it's not an ally of the U.S. And Europe is much more fragmented, and the Germans are leading Europe, and they have a tougher relationship with the U.S. than the Brits or than the French. They look at the world differently, more economically, less strategically, less geopolitically. So when you put all of these things together, even before we talk about President Obama, I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about the world, we see that the possibility of having an indispensable America, which was the core of the Cold War, is not where we are today.
But then, for instance, and forgive me, in the former American world, let's use that word, institutions like the United Nations, like all these international groupations, had a very huge voice. They still have a very huge voice, but do they still have the stamina, the strength, or the content to keep going?
My view is that we no longer have a G7 or a G20, we have a G0. We have a lack of global leadership. You have a superpower, but you have a lack of global leadership for reasons we just discussed. And that means that all of the organizations you just mentioned, which were US-led global institutions, will no longer work. And instead you can have two choices. You can have global institutions which will not have leadership, and they will get weaker, or you can have organizations that will have leadership, but they won't be global. They'll be smaller. And some of those will be led by the US. So I'll give you an example. On trade, you have people talking about the Doha round. It's dead. There is no more effort to do global trade agreements anymore. And so the United States decided, we can't do global, but we can do smaller. We'll do a coalition of the willing. We'll put a trans-Pacific partnership together with Mexico, with Canada, with Japan, 12 countries, 40% of the world's GDP. It's not as good as a Doha round. You'd like 100%, but you'll accept 40 because the world is no longer indispensable America. But you have, an important movement there. You look at climate, and we keep having global summits on climate. We have them in Copenhagen, we have them in Durban, we have them here in Cancun. And what happens? Nothing. Why not? Because global leadership doesn't work anymore. The U.S. isn't going to do it all itself. The Europeans don't play the role they used to. And there are many countries, emerging markets, that have different views, different perspectives, and they're getting more powerful. And some of the new institutions that are going to grow are not going to be like the TPP led by the U.S. Some of them will be led by other countries, like China, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Bank, the Chinese Development Bank. The Chinese are spending a lot more money with their multilateral institutions on investment into other countries than the World Bank and the IMF put together. That's a very different world order than the indispensable American world order.
So, in this new world, there is, and you mentioned that in a report you put forward at the beginning of the year, this new element, the terrorist element, a terrorist group that is as strong as ever before, the ISIS.
Yeah.
And yesterday the U.S. called for, not yesterday, it was in a meeting in Washington, President John Kerry called for a new war against a new enemy. Is that the way to go?
If you even look at Washington, at the most hawkish Americans, people like John McCain, people like Lindsey Graham in Congress, none of them are suggesting that the United States is going to put troops in these countries that will by themselves be able to defeat ISIS. ISIS has billions of dollars, they have tens of thousands of fighters, they've taken over a fair amount of territory, they're sophisticated with social media. They will be defeated, but it's going to take a very long time, and the Americans are not going to do it by themselves. And you know, it's interesting, I mean, Obama has been able to build a relatively robust coalition in Iraq. I mean, you have the United Arab Emirates, you have the Saudis, you have the Jordanians, the Egyptians actually engaged. I mean, Arab countries providing support with the United States in bombing in their own backyard. That's very important because it means that when things go badly, when civilians die, when they lose territory, those governments can't complain, they can't point the finger at the United States because they're part of it. It's very important, makes it more sustainable. But their willingness to engage in fighting, of course, and their capability is much less than that of the United States. So on the one hand, you get broader support, but on the other hand, it means that you can be engaged in this fight already for 7 months, and so far, ISIS still looks pretty strong.
Well, yes, so far. Now, a question, almost switching issues, switching themes now. For a risk management organization like yours, where are the main risks nowadays? Which regions or which situations create the biggest risks?
Well, the good news is that the two largest economies in the world, the United States and China, are not particularly risky right now. The U.S. is maybe not doing much proactively in Washington, but the economy is stabilizing and the politics are quite stable as well. And in China, despite all the transformation that's being made, the government's actually very strong. So this is the good news, that you've got a world that we've been talking about many things going badly, but you've got two big things going very well. What are the risks? The risks are very obvious. The risks are in the Middle East, the risks are in Eurasia, and they're in Europe. This triangle, right, where oil prices are low, and so the countries in the Middle East don't have the money to pay for themselves, never mind support security efforts in the region, never mind support human rights issues and all the rest. And so countries like Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan that are supporting all these refugees, they're in real trouble. The Europeans doing their damnedest just to try to keep Europe together with radically different perspectives between Germany, the core, and the periphery, including most importantly right now Greece, and have no ability to respond to the Middle East challenges or to the Eurasian challenges. And then Eurasia, with Russia taking 10% of Ukrainian territory in GDP, and no one's going to stop them. And they may take more. And Ukraine's going to fall apart. And now there's a question of how much farther the Russians might go as Russia turns towards China, as opposed to engaging economically with the Americans or the Europeans. So that is clearly, that's the core of your risk in the world today, is the geopolitics emerging from the Middle East, Europe, and Eurasia, and they're all playing into each other.
And for instance, in Latin America?
There are no geopolitical challenges in Latin America. I mean, clearly with oil prices down 50%, Venezuela's in a lot of trouble, and Maduro may not last the rest of his term, but that's not going to lead to a war against Colombia. And in fact, Venezuela's implosion has helped to facilitate the Cuban opening up with the United States, because they weren't getting the money through Petrocaribe. The Venezuelans didn't have it anymore, so Cuba had no choice. They said, we're going to have to go with the U.S. I mean, certainly Cristina Kirchner is a bit of a disaster right now in Argentina, and the potential for her to be impeached, and certainly going to have a hard time getting her preferred candidate in with coming elections. But there's no geopolitical challenge there. I mean, the big geopolitical issue with Latin America, I suppose, is Brazil. It is, here you have a country that is increasingly isolated. It's not a part of NAFTA. It's not going to be a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Government's not doing so well. Growth is basically flat this year. A lot of scandals. And they're part of the BRICS, and they're part of Mercosur. And that's like being the best house in a lousy neighborhood. I mean, that's not helping the Brazilians long term. And so you wonder, I mean, this big economy in Latin America is not really driving anything. I guess that's the biggest geopolitical challenge in Latin America.
Last question, and I'm very curious. In your report in January, You mentioned Mexico as a red herring.
Yes. Because people are concerned about, you know, the drug war in Mexico, and certainly the 43 college students that were murdered. They're concerned in Mexico about the corruption scandals around the president, his minister, his wife. I mean, this makes news even in the United States, not just in Mexico. But the fact is, number one, Mexico is attached to the U.S. economy. The U.S. is doing better. Number two, you actually have reforms in Mexico. You're changing the Constitution, and you're going to see the energy sector just explode with external interest. You have a desire to move forward the government in ways that will be very promising for the private sector. And you're not doing it responding to crisis. You're just doing it because it should be done. So I think in a world where the emerging markets are all over the place, and the BRICS are not panning out the way they used to, and many emerging markets are submerging markets, what you look for is whether or not you actually have a government that is making positive steps in reform, and Mexico is one of the few governments.
Te invitamos a seguir cuestionando la información con los siguientes videos.